Things are turning upside down in Russia. Political and social fractures have reached an unprecedented level. The cause of this fracture is not only the bad news coming from the front lines. The real turning point is that the cost of the war has begun to directly affect every Russian citizen's pocket, table, and future. The high cost of living, fuel crises, huge gas queues, and collapsing public services have exhausted the patience of the people. As this social patience reached breaking point, silence began to give way to loud criticism. Some Russian journalists working for state media are now issuing warnings directly targeting Putin and his regime. Dmitry Shechin, editor of the Komsomolskaya Pravda newspaper, was a loyal supporter of Putin at the beginning of the war. But today, the same man is openly saying that if the problems faced by the people are not solved, it could lead to the collapse of the regime and the end of Putin. Dozens of city council members in major cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg are calling for the Russian leader to resign. The most symbolic and daring act of this wave of courageous rebellion came from the Smolenskoye District Council in St. Petersburg. This local council went far beyond a simple call for resignation, breaking Russia's biggest taboo. The council members submitted an official request to the State Duma, Russia's parliament, demanding that Vladimir Putin be removed from office on charges of treason due to the war in Ukraine. This was a step equivalent to political suicide. To label a war that Putin called a special military operation and presented as a sacred patriotic duty as treason against the country meant declaring direct war on the regime's entire propaganda apparatus and legal coercion mechanism. However, these council members had constructed their arguments in an extremely careful and legalistic manner based on the regime's own constitution and laws. In their petition, they summarized how Putin's actions harmed Russia in 4 key points. These key points were the destruction of the army, demographic catastrophe, economic collapse, and strategic defeat. Of course, these Duma members did not harbor any illusions that the State Duma would process this petition and put Putin on trial. Their goal was different. Their goal was to light a torch, and they achieved it. These calls are not limited to liberal centers, but are spreading to regions that have paid the heaviest price for the war and are economically oppressed. Because living in Russia has now become, in the truest sense of the word, a battle for survival. Analyses by independent polling companies and reputable institutions, such as the Journal of Democracy, reveal the depth of this change. 57% of the population now say they support peace talks. The percentage of those who want the war to continue has fallen to 35%. In other words, it was understood that there would be no peace in Russia while Putin was in power. Another point these results indicate is that Putin must now leave, step down from his position, because the international sanctions now in place, rising inflation, and the increasing cost of the war at the front have placed an unbearable burden on ordinary citizens. Basic products such as oil, milk, and pasta are either very expensive or completely sold out on supermarket shelves. It has become difficult to find many medicines in pharmacies. However, perhaps the most striking area of crisis has been the fuel shortage. Not only driving a car, but also heating, transportation, and even sending children to school has become impossible. Gasoline has been unavailable in the Nizhny Novgorod region for about 3 weeks. According to local sources, even school buses are unable to operate in the Perevozky district. Transportation companies unable to find fuel have been forced to leave hundreds of school-age children at home. This situation has disrupted not only transportation, but also the fundamental right to education. The picture in Crimea is no different. On the peninsula, with a population of over 2 million, 50% of gas stations are completely empty. The zero on the station signs indicates that there is literally no fuel left. Moreover, this situation is not unique to Crimea. Across Russia, 2.6% of all gas stations have run out of fuel. At first glance, 2.6% may seem like a low percentage. However, the key point to note is that this figure is rapidly increasing every day. The collapse in fuel supply is not regional. It is a systemic crisis. Even in some regions where fuel is available, it is allocated only to state institutions. This means that all civilian use, except for ambulances, security units, or official vehicles, has been postponed. Citizens, despite waiting for hours in front of stations with jerry cans in their hands, are often forced to return home without fuel. And in places where gasoline can be found, prices have climbed to 80 rubles, which is an exorbitant amount for the large masses living on the minimum wage. Driving a car is no longer a luxury, it is almost impossible. On the other side of this tragic equation are the babushkas, millions of elderly Russians who have served this state throughout their lives and endured hardships are now being betrayed by their own government. The process that began with the 2018 pension reform and continued with the raising of the retirement age to 65 for men and 60 for women fundamentally shook this generation's trust in the state. The brutal cost of the war has deepened this crisis. To close the 2025 budget deficit, the Kremlin withdrew €4.8 billion from the Social Assistance Fund and transferred it directly to war expenditures. This meant seizing the savings and social security of millions of pensioners. Real pension payments fell by more than 15%, and worse still, reports began to emerge of weeks-long delays in the payment of pensions in remote parts of the country. Elderly people, accustomed to a regular income throughout their lives and trusting in the state, suddenly faced the risk of hunger and destitution. But this was not the only thing the Kremlin stole from its people's future. As the coffers emptied and the cost of the war increased day by day, the regime now set its sights on the people's present, on every purchase they made, on every bite of food on their table. This was the final and most ruthless act of betrayal. As part of the new 3-year budget plan, the Russian Ministry of Finance officially proposed raising the value-added tax, the country's most fundamental tax, from 20% to 22%. This may appear to be a technical tax adjustment, but in reality, it means placing the burden of the war's costs directly and most ruthlessly on the shoulders of all 140 million Russian citizens. As Alexander Shokin, president of the Russian Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs, previously warned, the VAT increase is the most unpleasant tax innovation for the business community and the public. This is because VAT is added to everything you buy, regardless of whether you are rich or poor. This tax hike hits the poorest segments of society and retirees the hardest, as they are forced to spend a large portion of their income on basic necessities. This is the state's attempt to finance the war by further shrinking the morsel in the throats of its most vulnerable citizens. So what is the reason behind this cruel step? The answer was given in all its nakedness by Dmitry Medvedev, deputy chairman of the Security Council, one of the regime's most hawkish figures. Medvedev explicitly characterized the 2026 budget as a wartime budget. This is an admission. It is the most official declaration that every extra ruble collected from the people will not go to hospitals, schools, or repairing burst heating pipes, but directly to sending more missiles, more tanks, and more bullets to the front lines. The state has found no other way to close the massive gap in the pension system and patch the budget hole created by the war than to impose new taxes that will further increase the burden on the people. Life is not easy for Russian youth either. The young people, who are Russia's future, do not see this war as their own. 81% strongly oppose a new mobilization, and this resistance is not just lip service. After the first wave of mobilization in 2022, more than 700,000 young Russians fled the country and sought refuge in neighboring countries. However, the war's insatiable appetite has pushed the Kremlin to find new manpower through even more insidious and ruthless means. Since an official mobilization announcement could trigger mass protests, the regime is conducting a secret second wave of mobilization. This is a manhunt carried out under the guise of volunteering, but in reality based on deception and coercion. Convicts, debtors, and poor young people are made to sign contracts with promises of high salaries and freedom. The aim is to fill the horrific losses on the front lines. However, this not only lowers the quality of the army, it also fundamentally destroys the younger generation's trust in the state. On the battlefield, Russia's casualty toll has reached a horrific level. According to estimates from various sources, the number of dead and wounded Russian soldiers has exceeded 1 million. This alone is a military disaster, and these losses can never be compensated for by the new soldiers arriving through the secret mobilization at the front. Because these new soldiers are untrained, equipped with old and neglected equipment, and more importantly, they are people whose morale is completely broken, who do not understand why they are fighting. The family's perspective on the mobilization is torn apart in the midst of this double betrayal. Soldiers' mothers had been the regime's main supporters for years, believing Putin to be the leader who brought stability. But now, their sons are not returning from the front, their pensions are not being paid, and the state is only lying to them. As documented by Medusa, the helplessness of a soldier's mother, who was detained by 11 police officers for holding a banner that simply stated her son's mobilization date, is the most symbolic image of this mass betrayal. These mothers are no longer the pillars of Putin's power. They are the strongest voices of the silent rebellion that has begun against him. This intergenerational betrayal is creating new and more dangerous dynamics in every corner of Russia. Local protests are no longer just about the political demands of a few activists, but are spreading around the most basic survival issues: unpaid pensions, collapsing heating systems, drug shortages, and children lost in the war. In small and medium-sized cities outside Moscow and St. Petersburg, these bread-and-water protests pose a much greater threat to the regime than political protests. This internal instability inevitably threatens Russia's federal structure. Regions are becoming increasingly reluctant to carry out orders from the central government. Local governors and mayors are caught between Moscow's pressure and public anger. As the cost of the war increases, new taxes introduced by the Kremlin to cover the shortfall in the pension system will further increase the burden on the people, multiplying the intensity and spread of these protests. At the same time, there is a risk of a new wave of emigration from the country. Thousands of people who couldn't escape the first wave of mobilization or who thought a second wave wouldn't start are now looking for new ways to leave the country under increasingly heavy economic and social pressure. This means Russia stands to lose not only its current soldiers, but also its future workforce, intellectual capital, and demographic structure. So once the bleeding has started, can Vladimir Putin really put an end to this trend? Does he still have the cards to silence the people's uprising and the whispers of the elite? Or is Russia being dragged uncontrollably towards one of the dark and chaotic pages of its own history? Over his 25 years in power, Vladimir Putin has developed a mastery of managing crises and neutralizing threats. In his toolbox, he has three main tools he will attempt to use to suppress this new wave of rebellion: an iron fist, propaganda, and bribery. Putin's first and most instinctive reaction has always been more pressure and more fear. The regime's response to those city council members who dared utter the word resignation, or to those soldiers' mothers who took to the streets for their sons who did not return from the front, will be a ruthless crackdown. This may not be limited to the arrest of just a few dozen people. The most likely scenario is that the regime will launch a new and broader wave of repression across the country to prevent this uprising from spreading to other regions. New, even more brutal laws may be enacted. The powers of the FSB and Rosgvardia may be further expanded so that any protest or opposition organization can be crushed before it even sprouts. The goal is to rebuild the wall of fear and send every citizen the message, "You could be next." However, this iron fist no longer holds its former power, because repression only works fully on people who have something to lose. How much can a mother who has already lost her child be expected to fear a 15-year prison sentence? What reason does an elderly person who cannot survive on their pension, who is freezing in their home and cannot offer a future to their grandchildren, have to remain silent? On the contrary, disproportionate oppression often fuels anger even more and can push even the undecided into the ranks of resistance. An iron fist can suppress an uprising for a time, but it does not eliminate the causes that gave rise to that uprising. On the contrary, it deepens those causes. Putin's second major weapon is his massive propaganda machine. If the people are angry because of economic collapse and war losses, that anger must be redirected away from the regime itself. At this point, it is inevitable that the Kremlin will tell a new story. The first part of this story is to increase the dose of the besieged castle narrative. The cause of all these economic problems, heating crises, or drug shortages, is not the war or the regime's incompetence. The cause is the collective West, which has sworn to destroy Russia. Those members of parliament calling for resignation are not actually patriots, but agents financed by the CIA. If that's not enough, Putin may resort to the classic dictator tactic of creating a scapegoat. The regime may sacrifice some powerful but expendable figures in the system to appease public anger. However, propaganda also has its limits. That limit is the harsh reality of everyday life. Who would believe the propaganda when state television says the economy is booming, but people see rising price tags in the market every day? Propaganda is useless when the refrigerator is empty. Putin's last tool is the system of bribery and patronage. The regime may try to buy the loyalty of key groups by offering them financial privileges. But even this tool's engine is now sputtering, because the Russian state's coffers are emptying. Buying loyalty with bribes only works when there is money in the coffers. When the money runs out, that loyalty evaporates. When we put all these tools on the table, we return to the first question: can Putin stop this trajectory? The answer is a complex but clear no. Putin can use these tools to slow the collapse, manage crises for a while, and crush the most vocal opponents. But he cannot eliminate the cause itself, the main cause of the collapse. Because all these problems have a single root cause: the war in Ukraine itself. As long as the war continues, Russia's young people will continue to die on the front lines, and the anger of their families will grow. Putin is trapped in a vicious cycle of his own making. So does this mean Russia is headed for total collapse? If by collapse we mean a 1917-style revolution where the people storm the Kremlin next week, that seems unlikely in the near term. However, if collapse means a state becoming unable to perform its most basic functions, severing its ties with its people, and slowly becoming paralyzed by its own internal contradictions, then the answer is a definite yes. Russia is already in a process of slow-motion collapse. The question now is no longer whether Russia will collapse, but what will trigger this collapse and how it will unfold. Will it be a major military defeat on the battlefield? A total infrastructure disaster in the middle of winter that will affect millions of people? What are your thoughts on this matter? Please share your opinions in the comments. Thank you for watching.